Welcome to J Lowe Artist. Thanks for being here. I appreciate your support and all those who have come out and commented, those of you who are drawing with me. So thanks for coming along. Thanks for being with me here today. But thanks for being here today and painting with me. Water paint can be a lot of fun. The first thing you want to do when you're doing an object like a turtle is you want to get your proportions and everything correct. So take your pencil and just very lightly do your simple shapes. You don't need a lot of detail here. You just need your simple shapes, your proportions, where everything is going to go. You may want to start out with your coral reef. I'm just going to throw in my coral reef here real quick. And it's not important that I get each individual ones. Nobody cares if one part of your coral is bigger than another part. But they're going to care if your turtle's eye is, where it shouldn't be. And so spend a little extra time to get your turtle right. So start out simple shapes. Here's his body. Just a simple shape, and do it very light. And just spend a little time to get that turtle about what you want it to be. Don't have to worry about details. Just right now, simple shapes and get things where they're supposed to go. Remember how we draw with our pencil like this, because we want this to be on the surface. We don't want a groove in there where we press down on it. And it's not so important that all your shapes and everything in the turtle's flippers are just right. A couple of years ago, I went to the Cayman Islands, went to Grand Cayman. We went to a sea turtle conservation and got to hold a little sea turtle. It was kind of fun. Remember, we're really studying a lot about technique today. So don't be concerned if it isn't perfect. The more you do it, the better it gets. Some people really like to see some drawing in there. So if you want to get in there and you wanted to draw some more in there, you're welcome to. It is totally up to you. I myself don't much care to see the pencil drawing part. Remember that your water paint is a natural fixative. And so whatever you draw on here will be fixed to the surface. So just simple shapes. That's really all you need right there. It's very simple. I'll make this a little larger so you can see a little bit more into it. And just draw as much as you think you need. This little nub on the end of his flipper is important. Draw it in. If you think, well, I'll just do that when I get to it, and just leave it out. For me, the little spots and things, it's not important if they're exactly in the right spot. No pun intended. We're going to paint back to forward. So as we start, we're going to start with all that water, the little lighter parts and the little darker parts. We're going to go from the darker part to the lighter part. We're going to leave out the coral and the turtle, and just get the background in. Okay, So the first thing we want to do when we start with the paint, we've got, as we've been talking, those drops of paint that we stuck in the first, our capillary action is pulling that water down into the pigments, into the paint. And it's mixing for us already. Every now and then we might have to add a drop or two to it, but we really don't need to mix it. Don't get in there and move your paint around, because what you're doing is closing off the pores. The paint is already there. It should be exactly what you need. And we're going to do all our mixing here by just letting that paint kind of mix by itself. So the first thing we need to do is we need to go in and get some water on our illustration board. Illustration board is lovely because it never wrinkles on you unless you get it far too wet, but you should be able to take water and just put it right on the surface. As soon as you do, you'll notice the water does not want to stick on the surface very well. There is a sizing. Just get the whole surface nice and wet. And so I'm leaving out the coral, leaving out the turtle, body of the turtle, and just painting around it. And I want it kind of soppy wet. You want it nice and wet. Not so much that it runs. That's probably too much wet. But like anything else, it's water management. And that paint is only going to go where the water is. So wherever you put the water is where your paint's going to go. And every now and then we'll have to get in and put some more water in it. So I'm going to start over at the coral and work my way this way, because as you put in pigment, your pigment runs out of your brush. So I'm just going to drop it in. See what happens to it? It just kind of goes fuzzy and soft. You want to paint fairly quickly, because with water paint, it really does dry very quickly. And just kind of fuzzy it out, getting kind of fuzzy and soft. I'm just going to now work my way past the turtle. As it starts feeling like it's a little too dry, get it wet. In some water. Just let it fuzz out, let it do its thing. Now, as I come out this way, I'm just going to kind of dabble it in. Don't be afraid to leave some areas light. It will kind of softly kind of fuzz out. It'll do its thing. You can always come back in with a little bit more. because you can layer color into it. That's the cool thing about water too, is it's never the same all the way through. You get light, you get objects. So don't rub it too much. Just let it do its thing. So as you're going through, just kind of dabble it in here and there, leave out little areas, because you can always come back in and do those areas. If you want to vary it a little bit, you can add a tiny bit of purple to it. Just dabble in some of that purple. Like I say, if it gets too dry, just take some water and stick it on there. If you're using watercolor paper, like rag paper or something like that, you have to tape it down to the surface. This is why I like illustration board, is you don't really have to tape it down. It just does its thing. Want to add a little bit of green to that too, you could. You know, think of that impressionism kind of a thing. If you feel like, I'm impressed with some color, I want to add some more color to it, go for it. And as you do this, and minutes after you've painted it in, it really is still doing its thing. And it just kind of rolls along and does its thing. Don't be afraid to let some of that light show through. And don't rub it too much, just let it do its thing. It's not going to look the same. Once you paint it on there, it's not going to look the same, because it bleeds and it rolls through and it mixes, and there's all sorts of wonderful little things. So the last thing I'm going to do is, where some of these light white spots are that I've left out, I've just taken and dipped my pen once, or my brush once, in water. I'm just going to go over it really quick, and it's going to be a light blue. All that's doing too is it's getting all the pigment out of my brush. So I want to clean my brush. I'm actually cleaning my brush as I do this. Because I don't want white in the background. There's really no white, but there are some very light areas. And the background is exactly that. It's just background. Now the coral's kind of green, but it has some darker shadows. So there's various ways you can do this. This technique I just showed you is called a wet on wet. We got everything wet, and we put wet paint into it, and now it's all wet. And it bleeds and blends and does things. But if you want to have some shadows and tight edges like we see in the coral, then you're going to do a wet on dry. So this section of your coral should be dry. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to take some purple, and that's going to be my wet, but on dry. And I'm just going to go in, I'm going to start dabbling in some things. So I'm kind of looking at the coral, and I'm thinking, okay, There's some little dark areas. And I'm just going to dabble it in. Let it just sit there like this. And you kind of look at it and go, okay, there's a shadow over here. I mean, it's not perfect, but some of the coral is a little darker here and there, and it's just dabbled in. So this is going to help us create our texture. This is just purple. Might be a little blue in it from my brush. You just want to kind of dabble in some of that texture. You can have larger areas, smaller areas, whatever you feel like you need. And we're going to let that dry. And luckily, we're here in the desert where our air is very dry. And so just dabble it in. You start anywhere you want to, top to bottom, left to right. And then that's just gonna dry. Don't do too much. And while you're doing that, you can do the same thing with the turtle. You can come into the turtle with that little bit of purple and say, you know what? I see some of those shadows. As long as his edges are dry. If this is dry enough to do, it shouldn't be soupy wet. If it's still soupy wet, don't do it yet. Keep working on the coral. If I can come in and do just some little edges, just the tip of my brush, just barely touching it. Here's his eye. This is where your drawing skills come in, because this is almost like ink drawing. You draw the darkest areas that you see. Like I say, if it's not dry enough yet, don't do this, especially on your edges, because it'll bleed into them. Because we're underwater, those purpley blue shadows are quite appropriate here. I'm going to do a little bit of wet on wet in here, where I'm going to drop in some yellow, maybe a little bit of orange. So I'm just going to come in with my brush and just take some sections off. When you're painting with water paint and you want to get some really sharp edges and things, you can just kind of do little sections at a time. In the Italian Renaissance, it had frescoes, which were paintings done on wet plaster, and each of their little sections are called giornate, which is an Italian word. It means day. So they would paint as much as they could get accomplished in one day. So if you look at some of those paintings, you can count how many little sections you've got, tell you how long it took them to paint that. So I think Madaccio's painting of the Trinity took like 27 days. A whole month. Give or take a day or two. So now that I've got water in there, I'm just going to pull out some yellow and I'm just going to touch it into there. Just dabble it in there, let it kind of do its thing. It'll roll along. If you get a little bit of purple in that yellow, it's going to turn kind of gray, which is okay. There's some little grayish areas in there. Also, your water paint tends to dry a little lighter than when you lay it down. So some of that yellow touched some of the blue and gets a little kind of green in there too. And that's okay. I'm just going to pull some of this out, some of these other areas. Now, I'm going to let my turtle dry for a minute. And I'm going to go back into my coral. Hopefully my coral's dried a little bit. And I'm going to just take and dabble water into it. I don't want to rub it because I don't want to get rid of stuff that I've already done. But that purple is going to kind of bleed a little bit. If it's too wet and it bleeds too much, then go, do something else. I'm going to take a little bit of green, just a little bit. I'm going to dabble in there. And I'm just going to let it do its thing. In other words, it's going to bleed. It's going to go all over. It's going to do its thing. But hopefully I'm going to get little blotchy parts of color in there. And they'll bleed out. Don't rub it. Just dabble it in. Just touch it. Touch, 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 touch. That's going to help us get our texture as well. And you can pull it from one place to another. Remember, it's going to do something different because it's going to bleed and the colors are going to run. But just dabble it in. Dabble, 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 dabble. Look how far your color can go. And don't be afraid to leave some little spots of white because we'll go back into them. You can just dabble in water and it'll bleed it out. Don't be rubbing it too much. Gotta remind yourself. Nice spontaneous way of painting too. So the blues and the purples and all those colors are now kind of mixing a little bit, getting that basic texture, and we'll come back into it, create some more shadows, some more textures, but our basic colors are in there. You can mix other colors in there too if you want. Where it's really light, you may want to just dip your brush in the water and get a tint of that color. Put that in there. I'm just touching it, just dabbling it in, not worried too much about it. And while we're doing this, the rest of this should be drying. So we can go back into it. If you need to clean your brush, just like I taught you before, dip it in your water, let it sit in your brush, and then pull it out in your paper towel that is in your offhand. So if you're left-handed, it'll be on your right hand. If you're right-handed, it'll be in your left hand. I just keep that the whole time, just because if I ever need it. But I'm cleaning my brush here in the paper towel, not in the water. The water should stay nice and clean. So as this is kind of drying, I can now come back into it and do more of a dry brush kind of a thing, where there's not so much water on my brush. I've gotten rid of the pigment. I've got my brush is fairly dry. Now I can come back in and I can use my other colors and just barely touch it. So you've got just a little, like a quarter of an inch of your brush. It's got pigment on it. And then you can come back in. You can do little thin lines. So he's got some little wrinkles around his face. I'm just going to use my brush, little thin lines to get those little wrinkles. If you need a little water, you could. But just barely touch that paint. Get a little tiny bit on your brush. And just barely touch it. I always start with the head. I think the head is a very important place to start. So this is purple. And over some of that yellow, it kind of turns kind of a purpley gray. It's probably a good thing to do. I can always go darker. So I'm just kind of starting with some of these light shapes, light areas. And always go darker. This is still that purple. Whatever I've got pigment in my brush, I'm still using that. I'll probably go back in with a little green in there. Just the tip of my brush. Barely touching it. Getting some of those soft, thin little areas. Some of these I'd probably use a little red or a little orange in there as well. I'm going to start out with a little green, just barely touch my green. I haven't mixed anything. I'm going to go over the top of some of those areas. You don't have to do it all. You don't even have to do it to the edges. You're just trying to get that feeling, that shape, that little bit that they've got there. Just dabbling in some paint on there, leaving some areas. This is that wet on dry. It's almost a dry brush in which your brush has hardly got any pigment in it. And anything that you feel like you need to go a little darker, it doesn't matter what color you've got on there. Value is more important than color here. So you can go back over it. A lot of that pigment is going out of my brush. And sometimes all I need is just a little water in there. My pigment is still there. We'll do a tiny, tiny bit of orange. Just a tiny bit. Orange and blue are complementary colors, and so if that orange gets a little purple or blue in it, it'll tone it down. It won't be quite as bright. It'll still be that orangey, nice orangey color. You just kind of keep going back over those things until it's what you want it to be. Just dabble it in, just touch it. If you want it a little darker, just take your purple. If you want to tone down that purple a little bit, you can take a tiny bit of brown. Just lay it into it. That'll help that purple. It'll keep it kind of warm too. Don't rub it too much. Just dabble it in and let it do its thing. My brush has hardly got any pigment on it, and it's not very wet. This is what we call the dry brush. It's more dry than it is wet. Creating some of those little textures that are in there. They're just little lines. It's amazing how far that paint will go on your brush. Don't be afraid to leave some little areas out. I know I keep saying that, but you got to remind yourself, oh, I don't have to paint everything. You can always come back in and add more. Kind of like ink drawing. I don't think we've used any black yet. I don't think I ever will on this one. I think the purple and the brown and the green, I think they'll do what we need it to do. Whatever color you feel like you need to put in there, it's probably the right color. I kind of trust that inner artist's eye. And if not, then you'll learn. You know, a lot of art is just trial and error. Does it work out? Doesn't it? I don't know. Always come back and do more. Also, one little thing that I like to do is just the shadows are going to be a little more cool than the light. The light might have a little bit of warmth to it. So you just kind of keep those greens and blues and purples in the shadow. It'll end up looking kind of like a shadow. Again, don't rub so much. Just drop it in. Let it do its thing. If you need to, you can put in a little bit of water and move it around. It's almost like stippling, where you're using dots to create things. But then the dots kind of bleed and become other things. And that's okay. Not really trying to follow the pattern either. If I had more time, I probably would, but right now this is just kind of practice, and we're just figuring out our style and our technique. Where it kind of fades, you start out with your color, then as your brush gets rid of the pigment that's on there, and it gets lighter and lighter as it goes, you can just dip it once in the water. Remember how we got our tints? And then just grab that and pull it down. And you'll get that variated dark to light kind of thing. It's mostly water. Very little paint in there. Want it to be light, just use either a little bit of water or you just kind of leave it out. It's all about water management. Now I'm just going back into it, and my brush has only got water in it. There's probably a little pigment left in my tip. For the most part though, it's just got water in it. I'm just dabbling in some of the areas that I want to blend a little bit, and just let it blend, just let it fuzz out and do its thing. Use the coral to get rid of all the pigment in my brush. This should be nice and dry by now. I can go back into it and dabble in whatever color I got in my brush. Kind of a little bit of a muted green down there. So I just added a little bit of yellow, knowing that I already had blue and purple down in there. So that'll mix with it and become that green. Same thing with the longest fin here. It's kind of yellow. So I'm just going to grab just a little bit of yellow, throw that in there. Don't go over it too much because it'll become muddy. But you just want to just dab it in, a little here and there. It'll mix with the blue, with the green. Just tone it down a little bit. Lots of different ways to do water paint. This is just kind of your out and about kind of technique. When Lewis and Clark were out exploring, they would do little paintings of things that they found, flowers, and you can't take everything back with you, but you can if you have pictures. Of course, they didn't have cameras, and so they used their art skills to document everything. Much of what they brought back not only is in the Smithsonian, but there is some of it in Monticello, Thomas Jefferson's place. He was president, and he's the one that sent them on their errand. So now it's just the kind of a touch-up time. If you want to tighten something up, remember contrast always gets you your tightness. So your darks and your lights. Your lights are already there, so you can go back in with any color, and that'll go darker. And remember, if you want it to almost look black, I mean, we haven't even used black. I shouldn't have even put water in the black, because we don't need it. But black is just all the colors mixed together, and so any colors you mix with it or with each other, you're just going to go darker. Get rid of that light area. If you want it to go lighter, just take your brush, put a little water on it. Now get rid of your pigment, dry your brush out, and then suck it back up. You'll get the lighter areas. I'm going to go back into the shadows of my coral. Only have a few minutes left, so you want to kind of finish up as much as you can. But you can go back into your coral with like a purple and just dabble in some more of those little dark areas. Get that texture in there. But thanks for coming along with me on this little journey. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope that you learned some things. And remember, art makes life better.